William Bowers-Bourne wasn't raised to be a savior. He was raised to be safe. In January 1875, he was 17 years old, studying at Cambridge, living the quiet, protected life of a rich American family that believed its fortune was permanent. Then a telegram arrived that tore the floor out from under him. Come home immediately. His father's estate was collapsing. The money was evaporating. Something was wrong in San Francisco. When William stepped off the ship and returned to Nob Hill, he found a household that still looked wealthy, but felt panicked. His father, William Bourne Sr., had come to California during the gold rush with nothing and built himself into a king. Mining interests, banking connections, insurance, investments stacked on top of investments like a tower that could only stand. As long as confidence held, and confidence had started to crumble. The center of the problem was the Empire mine near Grass Valley. Bourne Sr. had gained control of it in 1869. At first, it looked like a triumph. Then the ore thinned, and the deeper shafts filled with water. Pumps struggled. Costs rose. Profits disappeared. By 1874, the mine was barely breathing. Then, in July, something happened in Nob Hill's study. William Bourne Sr. was cleaning a revolver when it discharged. The wound killed him. The coroner couldn't say whether it was an accident or something darker. The city whispered anyway, because when fortunes collapse, people always want a more dramatic ending than misfire. For William II, the result didn't matter. The empire was his now, except what he inherited wasn't an empire. It was a trap. The investments his father had made were tangled together, leveraged against each other like dominoes. The mine was sinking. Debts were piling up. Creditors circled. People who had smiled at the family in ballroom light now watched them like sharks watching a wound. At 22, William Bourne II faced a simple choice. Let it all collapse. Or fight. He chose to fight. The experts told him the Empire mine was finished. They had numbers. They had graphs. They had the confident tone of men who want history to be neat. They said mining below 1,200 feet wasn't worth it. Water seepage was too severe. Costs too high? The engineering too risky? William didn't disagree with the danger. He disagreed with the conclusion. He believed the gold was still there. The problem wasn't the earth, it was the method. He brought in his cousin George Starr, barely 19 years old, but obsessed with mining technology and the mechanics of getting stubborn rock to surrender. Together they tore the operation apart and rebuilt it like a machine. Stronger pumping. Systems, improved drilling, smarter organization underground. And they hired Cornish miners from England men who came from families that had been digging into wet, brutal earth for generations. These weren't dreamers. These were professionals who understood water as an enemy you could manage if you respected it. For years, the mine barely broke even. Operating expenses ate everything. It would have been so easy to quit and preserve what little reputation remained. William didn't quit. He pushed deeper. 1,500 feet, 1,800, 2,000. By 1884, the mine turned profitable again. Over the next 4 decades, it produced nearly 6 million ounces of gold one, of the richest runs in California history. The boy called home from Cambridge didn't just rescue his family's fortune. He expanded it. But gold did something dangerous. To men like William Bourne II, it made them believe they had solved life itself, when in reality they had only solved one problem. He started looking for the next thing a growing empire needed. And in the 1890s, one need towered over everything else in California. Water. San Francisco's population was exploding. Natural springs and wells couldn't keep up. Private water. Companies waged ruthless battles for control because whoever owned the water didn't just sell a resource. They controlled the city's future. By 1890, one monopoly stood above the rest, the Spring Valley Water Company. It owned watersheds in San Mateo County. It controlled Crystal Springs Reservoir. It had powers like eminent domain, meaning it could seize land and water rights for the public good while operating as a private profit engine. William began buying shares. He didn't buy for influence. He bought to own. And by the end of that decade, he was no longer just a rich mine owner. He was becoming something far more feared. A man who could turn a valve and decide who thrived. That's where his story changes, because from this moment forward, William Bourne II isn't simply building wealth. He's building power. And power always creates enemies. William Bourne II didn't discover the land at Filoli by accident. He already knew it. Long before the idea of a country estate entered his mind. He had walked these hills in a different role, not as a private landowner, but as the man responsible for San Francisco's water. As president of the Spring Valley Water Company, William had spent years inspecting reservoirs, studying watersheds, and memorizing how rain, springs, and gravity moved through the peninsula. So when he began searching for a place to build his retreat, he didn't look where other wealthy families were building. He looked at land he already controlled. The property sat on the eastern slope of the Santa Cruz Mountains, overlooking Crystal Springs Reservoir, two massive bodies of water created not by nature, but by human decision. Creeks had been dammed, valleys flooded, entire landscapes reshaped to feed a growing city. William knew every contour of this terrain because his company had engineered it. What he saw wasn't just land, it was security. 654 acres of rolling hills, mature oak trees hundreds of years old, natural springs bubbling out of the ground year-round. Southern exposure perfect for gardens, complete privacy, no neighbors peering in from the road, no visible estate gates screaming wealth to passers-by. And most importantly, water. If William wanted gardens on a grand scale, irrigation would be essential. Water was life in California, and here he would never lack it. Springs fed creeks, reservoirs shimmered below. If all else failed, he quite literally owned the water system. The location struck a perfect balance. 30 miles south of San Francisco, close enough for business, far enough to feel like escape. An hour's drive on improving roads. The kind of distance that separated the city's chaos from rural calm without cutting ties completely. Timing mattered. The 1906 earthquake had changed everything. San Francisco no longer felt invincible. Fire had erased entire neighborhoods. Financial districts had burned. Thousands had been left homeless. Even families whose homes survived now understood how fragile permanence really was. The peninsula became a refuge for wealth. Families like the Crockers, the Coles, and the Carolans began building country estates, places designed not just for leisure, but for safety, space, stability, land that wouldn't crumble beneath them overnight. William was different. He didn't want visibility. He didn't want a house that announced itself from the road. He wanted a place that disappeared into the landscape, a valley that belonged to him alone. By 1914, William and his wife Agnes were entering a new phase of life. He was 57. She was 53. Their only surviving child, their daughter Ma, was already married and living in Ireland at Muckross House, the vast estate William had purchased for her as a wedding gift. This wouldn't be a house for raising children. It would be a house for what came after. A place for entertaining carefully chosen guests. A place for music and conversation. A place for gardens and long walks. A place, as William described it, to grow young. He believed deeply in a personal philosophy he had refined over decades of success and loss. Fight for a just cause. Love your fellow man. Live a good life. From those words, he created the name of his estate. Taking the first syllables, fee from fight, lo from love, li from live, he formed a single, elegant word, Filoli. To outsiders, it sounded European, refined, vaguely Italian. That was fine. William hadn't built this place to explain himself. The meaning was private, just like the land. There was one feature of the property that might have frightened a lesser man. The San Andreas Fault ran directly through it. One of the creeks cutting across the land marked the fault line itself, the same tectonic scar that had devastated San Francisco in 1906. Many would have seen that as unacceptable risk. William saw geology. The fault had been there for millions. of years. It would be there for millions more. You didn't flee it. You built carefully and accepted reality. For William Bourne too, risk had never been something to avoid. It was something to manage. By late 1914, the parcels were assembled. The land was his. The valley belonged to him. Now he needed someone who could give shape to his vision, someone who understood wealth, restraint, and California itself. He picked up the phone and called a man he trusted. Willis Polk. Willis Jefferson Polk had already lost everything once. By the time William Bourne II asked him to design Filoli, Polk was 57 years old and had spent more than 3 decades as one of California's most influential architects. He had designed banks, mansions, civic buildings, and commercial towers. He had helped shape San Francisco's skyline and then watched much of it burn. The 1906 earthquake didn't just destroy buildings. It erased careers, reputations, and assumptions. Polk survived all of it. His office rebuilt. His reputation recovered. By 1914, he stood among the architects trusted with the most important commissions in the state. William Bourne knew him well. Polk had designed Bourne's Webster Street mansion back in 1896, a house that conveyed wealth without screaming it. He had also worked on buildings at the Empire Mine in Grass Valley. Polk understood Bourne's taste better than most. Dignity over spectacle, permanence over fashion, authority expressed quietly. Filoli would be the most personal project of their relationship. When Polk arrived in Woodside, he didn't start sketching immediately. He walked. He studied the slopes. He looked at the light and the wind. He noted how the valley opened toward the reservoirs and how the hills closed in behind the site. This was not a place for vertical drama. A towering mansion would look absurd here, an ego planted in open land. The house needed to stretch outward, not upward. It had to anchor itself to the hillside and feel inevitable, as if it had grown there. Polk chose Georgian revival as the architectural language. It was a deliberate choice. Georgian architecture carried centuries of association with stability, order, and establishment power, symmetry, balance, brick construction. The architecture of colonial Virginia and English country houses. For William Bourne, it projected exactly what he wanted the world to see, control without excess. But California was not Virginia. Polk adapted the style intelligently. Instead of slate roofing, he specified red clay tile, a material associated with California missions in Spanish. Colonial buildings. It handled the climate better and visually connected the house to its environment. The brickwork was laid in Flemish bond alternating headers and stretchers that created a subtle pattern across the facade. It was more expensive and more refined than standard brickwork. Not flashy, just quietly superior. Every detail signaled seriousness. Inside, Polk organized the house around a grand transverse hall running perpendicular to the entrance. This created an enfilade, a series of rooms aligned so doors opened directly into one another along a single axis. From the reception room, a visitor could see through the drawing room into the dining room and catch a glimpse of the library beyond. This was a technique borrowed from European palaces, used to create drama and reinforce hierarchy. Polk used it not for spectacle, but for flow. The house felt larger than it was. Spaces revealed themselves gradually. The major entertaining rooms occupied the main floor. The reception room, the drawing room, the dining room, the ballroom. Family spaces sat above. Service areas were pushed into the south wing, separated completely from public life. Guests would experience elegance. They would never see the labor that produced it. The scale of Filoli was significant, but restrained. 54,000 square feet, 56 rooms. Large enough to impress, small enough to feel inhabited. There were no 90-foot entrance halls, no ballrooms built to host 500 people. Polk avoided the grotesque exaggeration common among Gilded Age estates. Filoli was meant to function as a home, not a monument. Construction began in 1915. The site required extensive preparation. Hillsides were graded to create terraces. Foundations were engineered to withstand earthquakes. Materials had to be transported carefully through what was still rural land. Polk didn't appear on site daily. He was juggling multiple projects. His office handled details. Contractors executed his plans, but William stayed involved, especially in ways that mattered to him. Waste rock from the Empire Mine was brought in and used for decorative elements and foundations. Stone pulled from the earth in pursuit of gold now became part of the structure that gold had paid for. William liked the symbolism. As the Georgian facade rose, the house began to reveal its personality. Tall French windows captured light and framed views of the gardens yet to come. Chimneys rose in elegant pairs. Proportions were carefully controlled so nothing felt heavy or aggressive. Inside, craftsmen installed parquet floors, each major room with a different pattern. The ballroom received quarters on white oak. The library was paneled in American black walnut, dark and serious. Moldings were hand-carved. Plaster ceilings were detailed but restrained. The ballroom became the largest space in the house. 70 feet long, 32 feet wide. A ceiling 22.5 feet high. Large enough for dancing, concerts, and receptions. Not so large it felt impersonal. 2 chandeliers modeled loosely after those in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Not replicas. Interpretations. Scaled correctly for the room. Agnes Bourne involved herself in select details. The music room needed perfect acoustics. She was an accomplished pianist and planned to host chamber concerts. The kitchen had to function efficiently for large gatherings. She cared about how the house would live, not just how it would look. William focused on connections to the gardens, to water systems, to proportion. He made sure the house sat correctly in the landscape, that views aligned with paths and terraces yet to be built. By 1917, after 2 years of construction, Filoli was complete. The reported cost exceeded $400,000, more than $10 million today. But compared to contemporaries, it was modest. Hearst was spending millions at San Simeon. Other peninsula. Estates cost far more. William Bourne had built something impressive without being vulgar. In September 1917, he and Agnes moved in. He was 60 years old. She was 56. Their daughter lived an ocean away in Ireland. From the terrace, William could look down toward Crystal Springs Reservoir, his water, his valley. He had survived collapse, rebuilt an empire, and created a place meant to renew life. He believed he had time. He did not know that within 5 years. A stroke would take his body and Filoli would become something very different from what he intended. Filoli was never meant to. Be quiet. It was private, yes, but not hidden from admiration. The house was designed to perform, and it began performing the moment a guest stepped through the front door. The reception room delivered the first message. 2 stories high, wrapped in dark. Walnut paneling, upward in controlled grandeur. A sweeping staircase climbed along one wall, drawing the eye toward the second floor. This was where Agnes Bourne received her guests, where first impressions were made, where visitors understood immediately who William Bourne was and what he had achieved. Nothing here was accidental. From this room, the enfilade revealed itself. Doors aligned perfectly so that one could see through the drawing room into the dining room beyond. The sightlines were intentional. You were meant to feel drawn forward, curious, compelled to explore. The drawing room softened the transition. Where the reception room projected authority, the drawing room invited comfort. Linen-covered walls absorbed sound. A Carrara marble fireplace, deliberately underscaled, created intimacy with informality. This was a room for conversation, not command. Guests paused here, settling themselves before dinner or drifting toward music and dance. But the drawing room had another purpose. Movement. It carried people forward without them realizing they were being guided. The illusion of spontaneity was carefully engineered. Then came the dining room. Dark-stained oak paneling ran from floor to ceiling. Hand-carved moldings framed the space. The table seated 24 a number that signaled power without excess. This was not casual hospitality. This was serious entertaining. Dinner at Filoli followed strict protocol. Guests dressed formally. Courses arrived in deliberate sequence. Seating arrangements were calculated with care, who needed to speak to whom, which alliances required nurturing, which business relationships needed reinforcement. Agnes handled these decisions quietly. Placement mattered. Conversations shaped futures. The room's gravity reinforced the message. This was a household that understood hierarchy and influence. Behind the scenes, the machinery of service remained invisible. The butler's pantry connected dining room and kitchen. Inside were a walk-in silver safe, an electric call board showing which rooms required attention, and a dumbwaiter to move dishes and food between floors. Guests never saw this space, but without it, nothing functioned. The kitchen itself was massive and utilitarian. A 17-foot-high coated ceiling helped dissipate heat from industrial stoves. Long work tables lined the walls. Storage areas held supplies for days of continuous service. During major events, the staff prepared as many as 9 meals a day family. Breakfasts and lunches upstairs, servant meals, and elaborate dinners for guests. At its peak, Filoli employed up to 35 staff members. Cooks, housekeepers, maids, gardeners, chauffeurs. They worked 14-hour days with 1 day off every 2 weeks. This was standard for estates of the period. The elegant guests. Experience depended entirely on labor they never acknowledged. The servants' quarters occupied the south wing. Small rooms, shared bathrooms, basic furnishings. These spaces were not designed for comfort or beauty. They were designed for efficiency. The separation between public splendor and private labor was absolute, and then there was the ballroom. 70 feet long, 32 feet wide. A ceiling soaring 22.5 feet above the floor. It dwarfed every other room in the house. Parquet floors and quarter-sawn white oak reflected light upward. Walls were painted a pale water green, trimmed with gold beef along the moldings. 2 massive chandeliers, crystal and gilded bronze, hung from the ceiling, modeled after those. At Versailles, but scaled to avoid excess. At the far end stood the fireplace. Baroque in style, carved from Machiavelli marble, and adorned with ormolu figures depicting Hercules, an Nemean lion. It was the kind of fireplace found in European palaces, not California homes. This room belonged to Agnes. She was a patron of the San Francisco Symphony and Opera. Music mattered to her. Chamber concerts filled the space with sound that rose into the ceiling and returned softened and rich. Guests sat in careful arrangements, listening as Agnes played piano or visiting musicians performed. The ballroom also hosted dances, wedding receptions, and debut events for society daughters. It announced that Filoli could rival anything San Francisco offered without ever being inside the city. For several years, the house functioned exactly as intended. Musical evenings, elegant dinners, weekend gatherings. William entertained. Business associates in the library. Agnes curated social life. The rooms fulfilled their purpose, confirming William Bourne's place at the top of California society. The house had been built to celebrate success. And for a brief window of time, success felt permanent. Then, in the summer of 1921, William began experiencing headaches, dizziness, moments of disorientation. Small signs easy to dismiss. He was 64 years old, strong-willed, accustomed to pushing through discomfort. Until the morning he couldn't. When the stroke hit, it didn't just change his body. It changed what Filoli was meant to be. While Willis Boak was shaping Filoli's walls and rooms, William Bourne was planning something he believed mattered just as much. The gardens, not decorative borders, not casual lawns. 16 acres of formal gardens designed, disciplined, and deliberate. William did not want nature left to chance. He wanted it organized into outdoor rooms, structured as carefully as the house itself. This would not be an English cottage garden, romantic and uncontrolled. It would not be a Japanese meditation landscape. It would be European in spirit, geometry, symmetry, order, gardens that expressed authority. William understood something fundamental about California. Water was power. Anyone could build a house. Only the truly wealthy could afford to waste water for beauty. Ornamental pools, lawns clipped to perfection, flowers planted for color rather than food. At Filoli, water would exist not because it was necessary, but because it was beautiful. To make that vision real, William needed someone who understood garden architecture as deeply as Polk understood buildings. He found him in Bruce Porter. Porter was 54 in 1917, a polymath in San Francisco's cultural world. He painted murals, designed stained glass, created gardens for the city's elite. He had studied European estates and understood the principles behind Italian Renaissance gardens, how walls, hedges, and axes created space and movement. Porter walked the Filoli land with William. The slope rising gently from the house toward the hills was ideal. Terraces could step upward naturally. Mature oak trees could be preserved and incorporated rather than removed. Rock outcroppings offered structure. Nothing needed to be forced. Porter's plan centered on a strong central axis extending south from the house. Along this line, a sequence of garden rooms would unfold, each enclosed, each distinct, each revealed only after entering. Visitors would never see the entire garden at once. Discovery was the point. Brick walls would define spaces and create microclimates. Hedges would provide geometry. Changes in elevation would control perspective. The formality would be absolute. Nature would be disciplined. But Porter understood structure, not soil. He could design bones, but he needed someone to give the gardens life. That role belonged to Isabella Warren. Bella, as everyone called her, was 48 when she joined the project in 1917. She came from an old California family that had lost its fortune in bad mining investments. With her sisters, she had built a floral design business in San Francisco, supplying elaborate arrangements for society events. She had an artist's eye for color and a plantsperson's understanding of what would actually grow. Wealthy clients trusted her completely. At Filoli, her responsibility was total. Choose every plant, manage seasonal color, ensure the gardens looked perfect year-round. Porter specified structure where walls went, how high hedges would be, where paths would run. Bella decided what lived inside those boundaries. The collaboration worked because neither tried to dominate the other. Porter designed architecture. Bella created living art. Work began in 1917 and continued for years. This was not a garden you finished in one season. Maturity required time. The first major space visitors encountered was the sunken garden, a rectangular space lowered below surrounding grade, centered on a reflecting pool holding roughly 8,000 gallons of water. The pool was lined carefully to prevent seepage. Water lily were planted tropical and hardy varieties blooming at different times of year. Twin olive trees flanked the pool. Panels of lawn softened the geometry. Japanese yew hedges enclosed. The space, clipped to perfect forms, the message was unmistakable. We control water. From the sunken garden, the axis continued upward through a sequence of enclosed spaces, the high place, the woodland garden, the rose garden. Each had a different mood, but obeyed the same architectural logic. Brick walls created warmth and shelter. Espaliered fruit trees climbed along them. Wind was blocked, light was shaped, views were controlled. Porter designed a bowling green, perfectly flat, surrounded by clipped hedges. No flowers, just geometry. An English dame transplanted to California soil. Another walled garden was divided, like a giant quilt, into planting beds. Bella filled these panels with seasonal rotations, tulips and daffodils in spring, roses and salvias in summer, chrysanthemums in fall. The colors changed, but structure did not. One of William's most personal requests involved Ireland. He wanted Irish yews at Filoli columnar evergreens that grew like living architecture. His daughter's estate, Muckross House, featured magnificent specimens. Cuttings were taken from Ireland, grown first at the Empire Mine Cottage in Grass Valley, then transplanted to Filoli. Eventually, 210 Irish yews lined paths and formed alleys throughout the gardens. Every walk through the garden echoed Ireland. By the late 1920s, Filoli employed 12 full-time gardeners. The head gardener, Louis Marangoni, lived on site and would remain for 50 years. Bella continued overseeing color schemes, making adjustments, ordering plants, and demanding perfection. By 1922, the bones were complete. The hedges were young. Trees needed decades to mature, but the vision was unmistakable. William could stand at the top of the garden, looking down past terraces and walls and hedges toward the house, with Crystal Springs reservoirs shimmering in the distance. He had built a place to grow young, but he was no longer standing. The stroke had already come. Maud Bourne, known simply as Ma, was born in 1883. She was not just a child. She was the child. An older brother had died one day after birth, and from that moment forward, Ma became the emotional center of her parents' lives. William built empires. Agnes cultivated culture and music. But everything they did carried an unspoken awareness that this one daughter was the future of the Bourne. Name. Ma grew up in the Webster Street mansion in San Francisco, surrounded by tutors, music lessons, languages, and the expectations placed on a wealthy Gilded Age daughter. She was trained to be accomplished, gracious, and respectable. Her life was carefully managed but not unloved. By 1910, Ma was 26 years old. In the social arithmetic of the era, that was dangerous territory. A woman of her class was expected to marry earlier. Whispers began quietly, as they always did. William and Agnes wanted security for their daughter, not just affection, but position. That spring, Ma met Arthur Rose Vincent. Arthur was Irish, from County Clare. His family had lineage and connections, but little money, a common situation among the Irish gentry of the early 20th century. Estates were expensive to maintain. Agricultural rents were falling. Many families were land-rich and cash-poor. Arthur was 44, 8 years older than me, a widower. The courtship moved quickly. William and Agnes approved not passionately, but pragmatically. Arthur was respectable. He was Irish. And most importantly, marriage would settle Ma's future. The wedding took place in March 1910 at St. Dominic's Church in San Francisco. It was a major society event. No expense was spared, but William's real statement came afterward. As a wedding gift, he purchased an entire Irish estate. Muckross. House sat beside Muckross Lake in County Kerry, an 11,000-acre property of mountains, forests, and ancient landscape. The house itself dated to the 1840s. A Tudor revival mansion that looked as if it had grown out of the land. The purchase made international news. An American mining millionaire had bought a piece of Ireland for his daughter. William didn't stop there. He agreed to cover the estate's annual operating costs, around $65,000, year plus a personal allowance for Ma and Arthur, equivalent to millions today. Ma would live not as titled nobility, but as something close. She would live like aristocracy. The couple moved to Ireland. Arthur managed the estate. Ma involved herself in local affairs and society. In 1911, she was presented at the court of St. James, an official recognition of her elevated social standing. For William, Muckross became more than a gift. It became a model. He visited Ireland repeatedly. He walked the gardens. He studied how an established estate functioned, how architecture, land, and history blended into something that felt permanent. Those lessons followed him back to California. They shaped Filoli. The Irish yews planted in Filoli's gardens were not symbolic abstractions. They were genetic descendants of trees growing at Muckross, a living connection across the Atlantic. But in 1921, the connection began to break. That summer, William suffered the stroke that took his mobility. His mind remained sharp, but his body failed him. He would never travel again. Ireland was gone to him, physically unreachable. He missed his daughter. Ma visited Filoli when she could. The journey by ship took weeks, and her responsibilities in Ireland were substantial. Still, she came when possible, bringing news, letters, photographs. William compensated the only way he could. In 1921, he commissioned Ernest Pixoto, a well-known American muralist, to paint large-scale scenes of Muckross House and its surrounding landscape. Pixoto worked from photographs and descriptions, creating misty Irish hills, reflective lakes, and the house nestled quietly in the distance. The murals were installed in Filoli's ballroom. Now, when William was wheeled into that room, Ireland surrounded him. He could no longer walk Muckers's path, but he could see them. Then came the telegram. In November 1929, Ma had been traveling back to Ireland after visiting friends in New York. She caught pneumonia during the voyage. By the time the ship docked, she was gravely ill. She died on November 18th. She was 45 years old. William was 72, confined to a wheelchair, too weak to travel. Agnes went to New York alone. Ma's body was brought back to California and buried on the Filoli estate, beside the infant brother who had died nearly 50 years earlier. After that, something in William shut down. He began selling his holdings. The Empire Mine was sold. Negotiations accelerated for the city to purchase Spring Valley Water Company. He was no longer building. He was closing. The Irish connection that had once symbolized continuity now represented loss. The murals in the ballroom showed a place he would never see again, where his daughter had lived, and where she would never return from. William lived 7 more years, and Filoli, built to grow young, became the place where everything he loved was buried. The summer of 1921 arrived at Filoli quietly. There were no warnings carved into the landscape, no dramatic shifts in routine. William, born too, was 64 years old, still involved in his businesses, still sharp-minded, still convinced that what he felt, occasional headaches, brief dizziness, moments of fatigue were inconveniences, not omens. Men like William did not stop for discomfort. They pushed through it. Then one morning, his body refused to cooperate. When William tried to rise from bed, his left side felt wrong-heavy, unresponsive, distant. His face tingled. When he spoke, the words came out thick and uneven. Agnes knew immediately that something was very wrong. Doctors were summoned from San Francisco at once. The diagnosis was unmistakable. A stroke. In 1921, medicine had no meaningful way to reverse what had happened. There were no clot-busting drugs, no rehabilitation protocols as we understand them today. Doctors prescribed rest and observation and little else. Survival itself was uncertain. William survived, but the damage was permanent. The stroke had affected the right side of his brain, leaving the left side of his body partially paralyzed. His leg could no longer support his weight. His arm had limited function. His speech recovered only partially. What made it crueler was that his mind remained intact. He understood exactly what he had lost. A wheelchair became permanent. For a man who had spent his life moving walking mine shafts, inspecting water systems, traveling between continents, the chair was not just a medical device. It was confinement. Filoli had to change around him. Ramps were installed where steps once were. Doorways widened. Furniture rearranged. Staff learned new routines to help him move from room to room. The grand house built to celebrate motion now required assistance to navigate. The gardens became both refuge and torment. William could still be wheeled outside. Staff developed careful routes along level paths, stopping at specific points where the chair could rest safely. Every morning, when weather allowed, William requested the same destination, the highest viewing point in the garden. From there, he could see everything. The terraces stepped downward toward the house. The geometric hedges clipped to perfection. The reflecting pool catching light. Beyond it all, Crystal Springs Reservoir shimmered in the distance. His reservoir, his water, his valley. He could see the empire he had built. He could not walk through it. Agnes adapted with a quiet strength that rarely appears in historical records. She took over responsibilities she had once shared. She met with gardeners. She oversaw staff. She made decisions about planting, maintenance, and repairs. She became William's legs and eyes in the garden. They had been married nearly 40 years. She had seen him rise from near ruin to absolute control. Now she watched him endure the slow erosion of independence. She did not leave. She did not complain. She adjusted. William refused to disappear. Though confined physically, he continued managing business affairs as best he could. Associates traveled to Filoli for meetings. Reports were brought to him. Decisions were still made from his chair. But the strokes didn't stop. Over the years, smaller strokes followed, each one stealing a little more. Fine motor control diminished. Endurance faded. Speech slowed. The process was gradual and merciless. Agnes filled the silence. She described the gardens to him after, walking them herself, what was blooming, which hedges needed attention, where the gardeners had done well or failed. She hosted small gatherings when William felt strong enough, keeping social life alive in reduced form. The great entertainments were gone, but Filoli did not fall silent. In 1921, William made one of his most revealing decisions. If he could no longer travel to Ireland, he would bring Ireland to himself. He commissioned Ernest Pixoto to create monumental murals for the ballroom scenes of Mucker's house and its surrounding landscape. Installed that same year, they transformed the room into a memory made permanent. Misty hills, reflective water, the house where his daughter lived. Each time William was wheeled into the ballroom, Ireland surrounded him. It was comfort and pain. Years passed this way. Morning trips to the garden viewpoint, afternoons of rest, evenings in the library or ballroom, depending on Agnes's plans. The routines became predictable, almost ritualistic. In 1929, the telegram arrived. Ma was dead. William was 72, too weak to travel, unable to attend his daughter's funeral. Agnes went alone. When Ma's body was returned to California and buried at Filoli, the estate crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer just a home, it was a cemetery. After Ma's death, William began dismantling what he had built. The Empire mine was sold. Negotiations accelerated for the city's purchase of Spring Valley Water Company. He was no longer preserving an empire for the next generation. There was no next generation. Agnes understood what was happening. She had been watching her husband fade for nearly a decade. The stroke had not killed him, but it had started a slow ending. In January 1936, Agnes fell ill. The records are vaguely likely pneumonia or heart failure. At 75, her body simply gave out. She died on January 20th, 1936. William was now alone. His daughter was buried in the garden. His wife of 54 years was gone. He was 78 years old, confined to a wheelchair in a 56-room mansion he could barely move through. He lasted 6 months. On July 5th, 1936, William Bourne II died at Filoli. The cause was listed as complications from long-term paralysis and repeated strokes. He was buried beside Agnes and Ma. 4 Bourne family members lay in the small cemetery on the estate, the infant son, the daughter, the wife, and the man who built it all. Filoli had been conceived as a place to grow young. Instead, it became the place where an empire ended. When William Bourne II died in July 1936, Filoli did not pass quietly to the next generation. There was no next generation. Ma was gone. She and Arthur Vincent had no children. William's siblings had their own lives and families, none eager to inherit a 654-acre estate that required constant, expensive care. Filoli was magnificent, but it was also a burden. Within a year, the estate was placed on the market. This was not a listing that appeared in newspapers or real estate brochures. Properties of this scale moved discreetly. The price was never publicly announced. Anyone capable of buying Filoli also had to afford the annual costs, gardeners, repairs, staff, infrastructure. The house alone demanded attention. The gardens demanded devotion. Many potential buyers walked away. The estate was too large, too expensive, too isolated, despite being only 30 miles from San Francisco. Filoli represented a lifestyle that was already becoming outdated. The Great Depression had changed attitudes toward wealth. Maintaining vast private estates no longer felt inevitable or respectable. Gilded age grandeur was slipping into history. Then one couple saw Filoli differently. In 1937, William P. Roth and his wife Lurline Matson Roth visited the property. Lurline was not impressed in the way most visitors were. She didn't focus on the scale of the house or the symbolism of power. She looked at the gardens and understood them. She was the daughter of Captain William Matson, founder of the Matson Navigation Company, whose white ships dominated Pacific routes between San Francisco and Hawaii. She had inherited wealth, but more importantly, she had inherited discipline. Lurline was a gardener, not a hobbyist, a serious one. She understood plants, seasons, and patience. She saw that Filoli's 16 acres of formal gardens were already extraordinary, but also unfinished. They were young. They could be refined. Her husband, Bill Roth, president of Matson Navigation, saw something else. Privacy. A place to escape. San Francisco's social obligations. A retreat that could still host gatherings without demanding them. They had 3 children, teenage, twin daughters, and a grown son. Filoli could function as a family estate rather than a monument. They bought it. The transition was respectful. Much of the Bourne furniture had been sold before the sale, but the architecture remained intact. The ballroom still held its Irish murals. The oak-paneled dining room still spoke of formality. The reception room's staircase still commanded attention. Lurline did not try to erase the Bournes. She tried to continue them. She worked to refurnish the house with period-appropriate pieces, rooms that felt lived in rather than preserved. But her true passion was the land. Isabella Warren was still alive in 1937, still overseeing Filoli's plantings. She was nearly 70, with decades of experience and little patience for amateurs. Lurline approached her carefully, not as a client who wanted control, but as someone who respected expertise. The 2 women formed a partnership. Together, they expanded the gardens beyond what William Bourne had envisioned. Lurline wanted more botanical diversity, camellias, rhododendrons, azaleas plants well suited to the peninsula's climate, capable of providing color year-round. The woodland garden received particular attention. New layers of planting created texture beneath mature oaks. Shade-loving species filled spaces that had once been secondary. The goal was balance, formal. Structure near the house, natural richness beyond it. In 1946, the Roths added something the Bournes never had, a swimming pool. It was not placed casually. It had to feel inevitable, as if it belonged. Isabella Warren designed the surrounding plantings and pool pavilion. Mature Irish yews were transplanted, an extremely risky operation to create an instant sense of age and enclosure. The move succeeded. The pool looked like it had always been there. History repeated itself quietly. In the late 1950s, Bill Roth's health declined. Like William Bourne before him, he suffered a stroke. Swimming in the pool had been considered therapeutic. It did not save him. Bill Roth died in 1963. Lurline was widowed at 70. She continued, living at Filoli alone, maintaining the estate with the same intensity she always had. She worked in the gardens. She hosted selectively. She understood every corner of the property. But by the 1970s, reality pressed in. The house needed updates. The gardens required year-round care. The estate demanded more energy than one aging woman could give forever. And Lurline faced the question that defines the fate of historic estates. What happens next? She refused to sell to developers. She refused to divide the land. Filoli was whole, or it was nothing. There was only one organization capable of preserving it properly: the National Trust for Historic Preservation. In the early 1970s, Lurline approached them quietly. Negotiations took years. The trust needed to be sure it could afford Filoli's maintenance. Lurline needed assurance that the estate's integrity would be protected. In 1975, she made her decision. She donated the entire estate house, gardens, and surrounding acreage to the National Trust. She also provided a substantial endowment to help cover operating costs. Her reasoning was simple. Filoli was too beautiful to be private. Later, that year, the gates opened. For the first time since 1917, strangers walked the gardens. They entered the rooms. They saw what William Bourne Agnes, Bruce Porter, Isabella Warren, and Lurline Roth had created. Filoli no longer belonged to one family. It belonged to everyone. Filoli was never meant to be famous. It had been built for privacy, shielded by land, trees, and distance from the road. Even after opening to the public in 1975, it was known mainly to gardeners, historians, and Bay Area locals. Its transformation into a cultural icon happened almost by accident. Hollywood found it first. In 1978, a film crew arrived at Filoli with a very specific problem. Director Warren Beatty was making Heaven Can Wait, a fantasy about a man who dies too soon and returns to Earth in the body of a billionaire. The story required a setting that could plausibly represent paradise wealth. So complete, it felt otherworldly. Location scouts walked Filoli's gardens and stopped looking. The Georgian mansion, the terraces, the symmetry, the light, it didn't look like a set. It looked like something already mythic. Filoli became the billionaire's estate in the film. The ballroom was transformed into a gym. The gardens framed scenes meant to suggest perfection. When Heaven Can Wait was released, millions of people saw Filoli without knowing its name. They didn't need to. The message was visual. This is what ultimate wealth looks like. The film was a success, critically and commercially earning 9 Academy Award nominations. Filoli had appeared on screen as something more than a house. It had become an idea. But that was only the beginning. In 1981, American television changed the scale of Filoli's visibility forever. ABC launched Dynasty, a primetime soap opera about the ultra-wealthy Carrington family and their oil empire. The show needed establishing shots that screamed power, dominance, and money beyond reason, something unmistakable. They chose Filoli. Every episode began the same way, aerial shots sweeping over formal gardens and a stately Georgian mansion, framed by hills and sunlight. The audience was told this. It was Denver, Colorado. It wasn't, but it didn't matter. Dynasty became a global phenomenon. At its peak, over 20 million viewers watched each episode. The show ran for 9 seasons, nearly 200 episodes. That meant Filoli appeared in opening sequences hundreds of times, seen by tens of millions of people worldwide. Most viewers never knew the mansion's real name, but they remembered it. Garden clubs recognized it. Architects recognized it. Californians recognized it instantly. International audiences, especially in Asia, absorbed its image as a symbol of American wealth and power. Filoli became famous without advertising itself. Tourism surged. Visitors arrived asking for the Dynasty House. The National Trust handled this carefully. Filoli was never officially marketed as the Carrington Estate, but guides didn't hide the connection either. The association became part of the lore. Other productions followed. The Joy Luck Club filmed scenes there in 1993. Television shows, commercials, and photo shoots used the gardens and exterior, but nothing matched the cultural impact of Dynasty. For an entire generation, Filoli was that house, the one that represented everything money could buy. By then, the Bourne family story had faded into the background. William, Agnes, and Ma were buried quietly on the property, unseen by visitors. Their tragedy wasn't part of the standard tour. The public came for beauty, not grief. Lurline Roth died in 1985, 10 years after donating Filoli. She lived long enough to see the estate succeed as a public site, but not long enough to witness its next transformation. By the 2000s, Filoli welcomed hundreds of thousands of visitors. The gardens were meticulously maintained. The house was refurnished with period-appropriate pieces. Volunteers led tours. Educational programs brought school children to learn about history, architecture, and horticulture. Filoli had become a living institution. Then, in November 2023, something unexpected happened. During the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco, President Joe Biden and President Xi Jinping needed a location for an informal, private meeting. It had to be secure, neutral, symbolic without being overtly political. They chose Filoli on November 15th, 2023. The two most powerful leaders in the world walked the same gardens William Bourne had designed. They spoke in rooms Willis Polk had created. International media broadcast images of the estate across the globe. Chinese media paid particular attention. Filoli had already been familiar to Chinese audiences from Dynasty. Now it appeared again not as fiction, but as a real place of diplomacy. A private estate built by a water monopolist nearly a century earlier had become neutral ground for global power. From private retreat to Hollywood symbol to diplomatic stage, Filoli had lived multiple lives, and it had survived every one of them because of a single decision made decades earlier. Today, Filoli receives more than 400,000 visitors every year. They arrive from across California, from other states, and from across the world, particularly from Asia, where Dynasty first etched the estate into popular memory. Garden enthusiasts come for seasonal blooms. Architecture students come to study Willis Polk's restrained Georgian design. Families come simply to walk through a place that feels untouched by time. What they encounter is something almost impossible in modern California, a complete Gilded Age estate intact. 16 acres of formal gardens still bloom, according to the vision Bruce Porter designed and Isabella Warren planted. In spring, tens of thousands of bulbs erupt into color. Summer fills the walled gardens with roses and salvias. Fall brings chrysanthemums and shifting foliage. Winter belongs to camellias blooming beneath oak trees. The gardens feel both historic and alive. They are not frozen. The house operates as a museum, but that word doesn't quite fit. Filoli is not a preserved shell. It is a functioning estate that still hosts concerts in the ballroom where Agnes Bourne once played piano. Weddings unfold along garden terraces. Corporate gatherings take place in rooms built for power and conversation. Most estates like this did not survive. Filoli's neighbors on the peninsula, the Crocker estate, the Cole mansion, countless. Others were divided, demolished, or fundamentally altered after World War II. Social attitudes shifted. Extreme private wealth became uncomfortable. Maintenance costs became impossible. Filoli survived because of timing and because it passed from the Bournes to the Roths to the National Trust without ever being broken apart. The 654 acres remain. Oh, that alone makes it extraordinary. Filoli also tells a complicated story. William Bourne built his fortune by controlling San Francisco's water, a monopoly that burdened ordinary residents. The empire mine that funded the estate relied on dangerous labor for modest wages. The elegance of Filoli depended on servants working 14-hour days. Modern interpretation does not hide these truths. Visitors now learn about the labor behind the beauty, the inequalities that made such estates possible, and the uncomfortable realities of Gilded Age power. The land's deeper history is acknowledged as well. The Ramaytush Ohlone people lived here for thousands of years before European settlement. The Lamchin Interpretive Center works with descendants to tell that story alongside the estates. Later chapters. Even geology speaks here. The San Andreas Fault runs directly through the property. A small bridge on the nature trail marks the boundary between the Pacific and North American tectonic plates. The same fault that shattered San Francisco in 1906 lies beneath Filoli's gardens. William Bourne built here anyway. He understood risk. You build carefully and you accept reality. 4 graves sit quietly on the property. William Bourne too. Agnes Bourne. Maud Vincent. An infant son who died in 1882. They are not part of the public tour. Most visitors never see them. But they are there reminders that Filoli was once someone's home, shaped by ambition, love, loss, and endurance. William built Filoli as a place to grow young. Instead, it became the place where his family ended and where his legacy began. The estate outlived his empire. Spring Valley Water Company dissolved. The Empire Mine closed in 1956. The fortune dispersed. What remained was not power or money. It was beauty. Filoli survives because Lurline Roth understood something. William could not have known in 1917. Some things are too beautiful to keep. Today, Strangers walk the paths where William was once wheeled in silence. They stand where he looked down, toward the house and the valley beyond. They hear music echo in the ballroom again. They experience a vision created by extreme wealth, but preserved for everyone. Filoli was built as a private retreat. It became a public inheritance. And that is its real legacy?